PowerPoint later. I don't know if is it okay for you.
Perfect. Yep, that's perfect. Just tell me when you'd like them.
Okay, so before I start, I would like to give a background about the history of Palestine, if you don't mind. And
Please.
I would like the students to go back to an Israeli historian. His name is Ilan Pappé, and he has a book under title of Ethnic Cleansing of Palestinians. And the most important thing that he's Israeli who wrote this book is not Palestinian. And he said in his book that on a cold Wednesday afternoon on 10th of March 1948, a group of 11 Zionist militia leaders, they put the final plan of ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And once the decision was taken in that room, it took some months to complete the mission. By May 1548, the mission was completed, and at that date, more than half of Palestinians' native population had been uprooted from Palestine. Close to a total of 800,000 people, they left their countries. And more than that, 531 villages were destroyed, four major cities, and a lot of massacres during that period performed. And as you are well aware, everybody well aware, that the British Army, after that they ruled Palestine from 1918 to 1948, they facilitated the immigration of those Zionist Jews from Europe to Palestine. And that was in response of Balfour Declaration to establish a nation or national home of the Jewish people in Palestine. Balfour was the Prime Minister of Britain in 1917. Back to my story. My mother, actually, Fatima, she was living with my father as well in a little town called Lubia, located 10 kilometers in the west of Tiberia, north of Palestine. And that little town, in addition to other towns in Palestine, were destroyed in the year of 1948. My mother told me at the beginning, she remembered, of course, at the beginning of the year 1948, she said, we saw Zionists supported by British troops building up a big settlement in the southern area of the village. And they start to do some training as a military training in the fields. Some days later or some weeks later, those settlers were seen in military uniforms, carrying weapons and preparing themselves as if the war is around the corner. Everybody in the town was alerted and looking with fear of the uncertain future. My mother said, those guys were preparing to kill us, and we had no guns in the village to protect ourselves, except only with the rich people. And she said, I could not imagine that the war is so close. In reality, the war was so close. She said she remembered exactly the first day of the attack. And she told me, it was about by mid of spring 1948. She said that we woke up on a sound of bullets coming from the west side of the village. People, mostly men, rushed towards the sound of the suspicious bullets in that area. And they were, of course, the women were screaming. It was clear that those Zionist gangs were attacking the village. And as a result, thousands of villagers were running towards the attackers with sticks, stones, and few guns that they had. And the attackers, for sure, they killed some villagers and left the place very fast. That was the first day of the war. That night, men were spread around the village with their very basic and old guns. everyone was really not believing his eyes, she said. She told me that we lived in peace for hundreds or thousands of years in a good relation with everybody, including our Jewish neighbors who came to Palestine fleeing from Hitler after the Holocaust, searching for safe haven that we give them. What happened? What will happen? We all were scared on that disastrous day. So we stayed at homes waiting what will be happening. One night, she said, suddenly we heard a fear deep sound approaching slowly and slowly and slowly to the village. We could not understand what was that sound. The sound became slowly closer, closer. It was an aircraft. It came close above the village and dropped all of its bombs on the village, leaving behind death and fear. Of course, from where they get those aircraft, they get all their weapons, equipment, aircrafts from British troops. Because British, during that period, the army of Britain were planning to leave the country and hand over the whole country to the Zionists. So after that night, those kind of attacks repeated, and only during night. The villagers, of course, men, women, children, rushed randomly to the caves. There were some caves around the village. Everybody stayed in those caves surrounding the village the whole night. And since then, she said, caves became our shelter during night. Day by day, night by night, the village was almost burning out. And frankly speaking, there was no possibility to continue fighting back. We don't have the necessary equipment and guns to fight back. There were no possibility to get the proper weapons from the surrounding areas either. There's no way to go to Syria, Lebanon, or it's not easy to go and buy. We don't have money to buy those equipment. Although there was legendary resistance, she said, but the question was, till when? In reality, this was the very big question. And in mid of April 1948, something very seriously happened. That was the Zionist gangs. They did a big massacre in a village called Deir Yassin. Deir Yassin is a Palestinian Arab village near Jerusalem. This incident scared the Palestinians all over Palestine because they killed about 20% of the people in that village. And this Deir Yassin massacre, in spite of other massacres occurred during that period, but this one considered as the most horrible, scary one. Why? She said, Deir Yassin was considered the most hurting and critical massacre in Palestine history just because there was a deal between Deir Yassin inhabitants and the Zionist leaders not to fight each other. Although there was this deal, the Zionist gangs, they killed midnight and they killed almost 20% of the people in that village. After Deir Yassin, people started seriously thinking to leave their homes and escape. And the impact of this horrible massacre was huge on the morale of Palestinians during that period. In May 1948, some surrounding villages fell down in the hands of the Zionists. Our village, Lubia, became besieged from the south, west, and east, and the situation became worse. About May 10th exactly, Arab Salvation Army arrived to our village. Leaders of the community took the hard decision during that night to leave immediately, to escape actually immediately north to Lebanon. requesting residents to evacuate for a period of 2 weeks in order to facilitate for the Arab Salvation Army resist the attacks. Arab Salvation Army was an army of volunteers, as you know, maybe you know, from Arab countries. The actual number of those volunteers deployed might have been about 3,500 volunteers, while the Zionist gangs were 45,000. It's less than 5%. And Salvation Army was not official army with no experience of fighting. That night, she said, my mother, the Zionist militias started heavily shelling the village and preparing to invade any moment. Everybody was scared of another massacre. She said, we decided to take the donkeys and cows and some food and some pots and leave the country. We left behind everything, our houses, our furniture, animals, harvest, and our memories. We took very little with us, some blankets, pads, cushions, etc. And we started our refuge trip north to Lebanon. Midnight, the convoy was hastily prepared. Everybody fastened his cows and goats with plenty of food and water for them enough to 2 weeks, as they thought that it's 2 weeks. And some people dug a big hole to hide the water pumps that they had. My sister, she said, who has recently engaged, preferred to collect some presents her fiancé brought to her instead of taking food and other stuff. Very fast in the dark, the convoy moved where you can only hear women, men, and children crying and moaning. Some men were guarding the convoy while women carried their children and provisions, and they continue heading north. Everybody was walking fast up the hills and valleys, scared of any backward attack by the Zionist gangs. In 2 days or more, we reached the Lebanese borders. We had no water to drink, no medication, and some food. We were received by the Red Cross and the Lebanese army, and the convoy had some rest in Bint Jbeil village in south of Lebanon, under a big olive tree which became our home for 3 months, not 2 weeks, 3 months, under the olive oil. She said we tried several times to go back during those 3 months to Palestine. But every time we stopped by the Lebanese army, they kept saying landmines were planted on the roads, don't go back. Some people, they tried to go back, but they never came. They died. So after 3 months under the olive tree, the Red Cross moved us by train, all train, 200 kilometers north Lebanon, Syria. We were advised not to come back, stay there. So we stayed in Aleppo city for about some weeks, and we decided to come back to Bekaa Valley, which is next to the Syrian borders, not far from Palestine. And the idea was to be as close as possible to Palestine borders. And we stayed in that camp, it was a little camp, for 7 years, not 2 weeks. In that camp, me personally, I was born in the year 1955. And in that camp, I remember we had a small little room with no electricity, no water, no kitchen, no sewage, nothing. And the only support we had was UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency. UNRWA was providing almost everything for us in the field of relief, education, health programs, and social services, and almost everything. And Palestine refugees in that camp and other camps were able only during that period to find seasonal works. They were allowed only for seasonal works in agriculture and construction, only. Unfortunately, they were not allowed to work like in 72 jobs were off limit to Palestinians, such as, let us say, admin works, commercial works, health, banking, mechanics, electricians, teachers, etc. They were not allowed to do that. And unfortunately as well, the Palestinians were considered as foreigners. Even if you're born in Lebanon, you have no right to get the Lebanese or Syrian or Egyptian or whatever Saudi Arabian passport. You are not allowed. You are foreigner. Since 1948 until this moment, we are foreigners in the Arab world. We have now recently, we count 5.5 million Palestine refugees living in camps since 1948 up till this moment. Mostly UNRWA is the only source of those Palestinian refugees. Unfortunately, Mr. Trump cut the support for UNRWA last year. USA used to give UNRWA $400 million that were cut last year, and we have, I don't know where we are going. So that's my story. I'm sorry if it is harsh, but this is the reality. And thank you for listening. If you have any question, you're welcome.
Thank you, Maya. That's it's a very disturbing story. We have questions. So Ron Way's giving you a clap. We're gonna I'll clap for you more when you finish. I'm sure you all have questions for Imayat. Go ahead. Don't be shy. I'm just going to give them a minute to think of their questions because.
Yes.
So he was talking about the different massacres